Hello, friends, and thank you for joining me on the Finding Elevation podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Thompson. I am a mountaineer. I've coached hundreds of aspiring mountain athletes to reach their goals. I also am the author of the book, Finding Elevation, Fear and Courage on the World's Most Dangerous Mountain. And I am super passionate about learning and growing through adventurous pursuits. That's why this podcast is dedicated to encouraging, uplifting, inspiring, and educating people like yourself who aspire to elevate their lives through the outdoors. So let's get into it. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Finding Elevation podcast, where we like to share tips about everything you need to know to prepare for your next mountain adventure. And today, since it's the end of summer in the Northern Hemisphere, we are going to talk about preparing for climbs in the Southern Hemisphere, which usually happen in the winter time here and the summer, of course, in the Southern Hemisphere. So one of the big summits that most people are preparing for is, of course, the highest peak in that hemisphere, which is Aconcagua. Aconcagua is in Argentina, and that'll be the focus of our conversation today. So as you know, I like to start out with a little history. So the name Aconcagua has a few different meanings. It's believed to have originated from the Quechua language, which was spoken by the indigenous people of the area around Aconcagua. And the exact name, as I said, is subject to a little bit of debate, but it's generally thought to either mean stone sentinel, which is what I've always heard, or snowy peak. There's not a lot of snow in Aconcagua, so I'm going to go with Stone Sentinel. It was first summited in 1911 after first being attempted in 1883. So just pause for a second and think about what things must have been like in South America at the turn of the century and the type of gear we had available to us, boots, crampons, knowledge of weather, the route. I just am always so floored by people who made these first attempts of mountains that we're still climbing today and everything that they had to endure in order to get to the summit of the mountains that we love. The first female attempt of Aconcagua occurred in 1908. She didn't succeed in summiting, but I'm always completely enamored with Annie Peck Smith because at the age of 58, that's how old she was in 1908. She made an attempt to climb this unsummited peak in South America, Aconcagua. And she didn't reach the summit on that particular attempt, but she was very pioneering in terms of mountaineering for her time and also went on to be a big advocate for not only women's rights, but also women in the outdoors. So yay for Annie. So she wasn't the first woman to summit Aconcagua. That would happen many years later in 1940. When Adrienne Bance, who was a French climber, made it to the summit first. But still huge recognition and thanks to those pioneering women. So Aconcagua, the climbing season runs from November to March, which again is summer in South America. And there are a number of routes, which we'll talk about, but just to sort of create the framework for these routes and these summits. Aconcagua is the highest peak not only in the Southern Hemisphere, but also in the Western Hemisphere. It's on the border between Argentina and Chile. It's the highest peak outside of the Himalayan mountain range, which is pretty amazing. And its summit is at 22,834 feet or 6,962 meters above sea level. So really a substantial peak in the Andean mountain range, and one that is coveted, of course, by people who want to summit all 7 summits because it's one of the 7 summits, but also with people who are just, trying to see how their bodies perform at elevation and want a bigger challenge than maybe some of the peaks in North America. So there are 2 routes that are typically climbed. We'll focus this conversation on those. There's the normal route, which is, as the name suggests, the most commonly climbed route. And then there's the 360 route, which is becoming, in my experience as I coach people, it's becoming more and more popular. And that was actually the route that I climbed back in 2012. So we'll start first with the normal route. in terms of technical difficulty, very low. I don't want to oversimplify it because I think one of the problems with Aconcagua is that people underestimate its challenges. But in terms of technical difficulty, the normal route is very straightforward. It will take most people, I would plan for 3 weeks. That's what most guide companies will quote you to reach the summit and then safely return. In all, you'll cover a distance of 42 miles, which is pretty daunting. And that will give you a gain of just over 13,000 feet. We'll talk about the route in more detail. The success rate of the normal route is about 50%. Most of the resources I found said between 40 and 60%. So that route starts in the Horicones Valley, where you basically follow that river for the first several days that you'll be climbing. And you'll reach some intermediate camps along the way. I should say that the trailhead, the starting point, is already very high elevation, 9,700 feet almost. You'll camp along the way at some intermediate camps where you're really just trekking. You haven't gone to base camp yet. You're just sort of making your way up the lower slopes of the mountain. And eventually then you'll reach base camp, which on this route is called Plaza de Mulas. It's at 14,300 feet. And it's a really big space. There'll be a lot of people there, a lot of teams, everyone sort of acclimating and preparing to climb higher. Most teams, when they reach that elevation, will spend a couple of days at base camp just getting settled and getting acclimated. And then you will start climbing with all of your gear. This is not like Himalayan base camp setup where you leave some of your gear behind. You will take all of your gear with you as you ascend the mountain. So once you leave base camp, there will be 3 intermediate camps that you'll stop at. And the elevation between them is between 1,000 and 2,000 feet. Those camps are Canada, Camp Condorus, and then you have a couple of options for Camp 3, either Camp Cholera or Berlin Camp. They're both located at about the same altitude. Regardless of which route you attempt on Aconcagua, you'll be carrying all of your gear with you as you move from camp to camp. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges of climbing Aconcagua without employing a local porter to carry your gear. And that is that you're carrying probably 60 pounds up the mountain. And that may not seem unmanageable when you're on your local hike at sea level or at your home elevation. But carrying that amount of weight at 18,000 feet is very challenging. And most of the people who I coach who aspire to climb Aconcagua and carry all of their own gear, when they get about to Camp 2, decide that they'd like to have a porter to help them with the rest of the way, help them carry their gear the rest of the way. And there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's entirely up to you and it's a personal decision. But I think it's important to be realistic about how it feels to carry that much weight at elevation. Both the routes, the normal route and the 360 route, in at an area called the Canaleta, which is a very steep, rocky section that leads you eventually to the summit at 22,800 feet. Let's switch to talking about the 360 route, which starts in a different valley. It starts in the Vacas Valley, and it follows that river, the Vacas River, as you're meandering towards base camp. Again, like on the normal route, there are a couple of lower intermediate camps that you will stay at as you're making your way. And they're sort of like, they reminded me of cowboy camps. Like there were local wranglers there. There was a fire, sort of a cozy place to camp where you're, just walking from day to day in very moderate rocky terrain. On the 360 route, you reach Plaza Argentina, which is your base camp on that side of the mountain. That's a little bit lower than on the normal route. That's at 13,780 feet. And just like on the other side of the mountain, you will stay there for a couple of days and get acclimated, sort of get settled. And then you'll start making your way up the rest of the mountain. Again, just like on the normal route, on the 360 route, there are 3 intermediate camps that you will stay at. The highest of those camps is at 19,500 feet. And most people, which is the highest of those camps, is at 19,500 feet. So your high camp on both sides, on both routes, is at the same elevation. What I've noticed in recent years is that some people who are climbing the 360 route will start their summit push from Camp 2 at 18,000 feet. And that may be for various reasons. Often it's because there's a short weather window and they want to, make sure they have their best shot at getting the best weather for the summit attempt. But keep that in mind that even though there may be 3 camps that you could use for your climb, because of weather conditions, your team may choose to start your summit attempt from lower on the mountain. If you choose to climb the 360 route, once you summit, you will actually descend via the normal route. So one thing that I like about the 360 route is that you really get to see a lot of the mountain as you're climbing because you get to experience both routes. The 360 route is longer. It's about 64 miles as opposed to 42. And the elevation gain is 15,000 feet. If I have to, and I've only climbed the 360 route, not the normal route, but have worked with plenty of people who have. And I actually prefer the 360 route because there are fewer people on it and you get to experience more of the mountain. It is a little bit longer, and so therefore it takes a little bit more time to complete than the normal route. But the 360 route, because it circles the mountain, it offers a little more gradual acclimatization, whereas the normal route is a more direct and therefore shorter route to the summit. There are fewer people, although I think the popularity is increasing. There are currently fewer people on the 360 route because it's less popular. And so you're more likely to have, a more solitary sort of nature experience with fewer climbers on the route if you choose to take the 360. So that's a quick overview of the most popular routes. Of course, your guide company will give you a detailed itinerary of where you'll be from day to day and how long you'll be climbing from one camp to the next. If I think about the challenges on Aconcagua, I mentioned heavy pack if you're not using a porter. The other thing is weather. And I think that people very often underestimate this mountain and overlook just how harsh the weather can be. I think because the terrain on Aconcagua is predominantly rock and not snow and not glaciers, people just assume that somehow means that the weather is better, but it's not at all. So I took a look at typical temperature ranges, and at lower altitudes, so we'll just say base camp elevation, which is the same on both sides of the mountain. The weather during a typical November climbing season might be pleasant. It might be in the 50s or even 60s at base camp. Of course, though, as you ascend, those temperatures are going to drop and you may experience temperatures way below 0 Fahrenheit as you ascend the mountain. As you get into December and January, those temperatures are going to warm up because now we're moving further into the summer season, but you still could see summit temperatures in the, 0 or -10 at the summit. So don't underestimate how cold it can be on the mountain, and then pair that with the strong winds that Aconcagua is known for, especially at higher elevations. They obviously will make temperatures feel much, much colder. When I was summiting Aconcagua, we got to a col on the route that we were going to camp at, and it was so windy that it took 5 of us to assemble our tents, and someone had to constantly be standing on the tent or piling rocks on the tent as we were putting it up to keep it from blowing away. So the wind will be a constant on Aconcagua. I think you can count on that. And I think winds make everything much more difficult. If I think about reasons that I've been turned around on a mountain, it is much more often wind than it is precipitation. And speaking of precipitation, Aconcagua is a very dry mountain. November and December are generally drier months. So your chances of precipitation are low. However, as we all know, conditions can change very quickly in the summit on a mountain, especially at the summit, and snow is a possibility. Though in my experience, we're not talking about feet of snow like on other mountains. We're talking about a dusting or a few inches, and very often on Aconcagua, that snow is blown away or even melts very quickly. Towards later on in the climbing season for Aconcagua, so looking more at January and February, there is a slighter chance of precipitation, but it is always, again, something that you should be prepared for as you're climbing. I actually took a look I think this was in December. I just took a peek at mountain forecast to see what the current temperatures and winds were on Aconcagua. And on this particular day, the winds at the summit ranged from 70 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour. And the temperature was between -9 and -17. So just to give you a little flavor of what conditions can be like on the mountain, I would expect dry and windy. The terrain on Aconcagua, if you've heard me speak about Aconcagua before, I often refer to it as just a giant pile of rock. I guess goes back to the name, the Stone Sentinel. So there may be some snow at higher elevations, but as I said, it's generally not significant. There aren't any glaciers that you have to navigate or deal with on Aconcagua. It instead is every possible kind of rock, from sand at lower elevations to talus to boulders to scree. You will experience it all on Aconcagua. And we'll talk a little bit about preparation, but being comfortable on that kind of rocky terrain is very important, primarily because if you're comfortable moving on rocks, it allows you to move more efficiently during your climb, and that allows you to save some energy. And it also just makes you more confident as you're navigating and as you're climbing higher and higher. In terms of skills and what's needed for both route, in my view, you don't need prior climbing experience. This Aconcagua is often climbed as the first big peak at elevation for people. And so there's, no technical skill needed or required. You may, on the 360 route, a lot of guide companies will request that you bring crampons and an ice axe and a harness. And you may or may not use that walking to the Canaleta, depending on conditions on the route. So if it's just rock and there's no snow, you very likely won't use those things. But if there is some snow on that day, for safety, you would then rope up and need crampons and an ice axe and a harness. You, as I mentioned, can use porters to carry your weight. And my view is it's highly recommended to do that. I think it increases your chances of success. It lets you focus on taking care of yourself and moving efficiently. In terms of training, it also means that there's less of a requirement to build the strength needed to carry a heavy backpack, because instead your backpack, if you're using porters, will weigh 20 or 25 pounds, and you'll give the rest of your gear to a porter who will carry it for about, when I checked recently, the going rate for a porter was about $1,000 for them to carry 20 kilograms from base camp to camp 3. So to me, that's well worth the investment to make sure that you're able to just focus on moving efficiently. Your training is less complicated. I think there's less likelihood of injury if you're carrying a lighter backpack, and you're able to increase, for most people, your chances of success, or at least making it to the summit. In terms of a progression and where Aconcagua lies, as I said, for most people, they've done some climbing in the Cascades. Maybe they've done some 14ers in the winter, or they've climbed the volcanoes in Ecuador or Mexico, or climbed Kilimanjaro, and they want to take on something more complicated and more challenging. So I think it's important to have been at elevation. Kilimanjaro is definitely a good test of that, about as high as you can go, probably without having some technical requirements associated with your climb. And that's important because you get to see how your body reacts at elevation. And of course, how your body reacts today is no guarantee for how it's going to react the next time, but it at least gives you a sense and some experience of being at elevation. So climbing something like Kilimanjaro, I think, is good. And then having some time on a true expedition, I think, is also important. And you don't really get that in Ecuador because you get to stay at huts and it's very civilized. But on Aconcagua, you're moving from camp to camp. And for some people, sleeping in a tent is difficult. It affects your sleep. It's just uncomfortable for some people. So the more experience you can have on an expedition, I think, is important and will set you up for success on Aconcagua. We will talk next about training, my most favorite subject. It is very important, as I said, to be comfortable ascending and descending steep, unstable rock while carrying a backpack that weighs about what it'll weigh for your climb, whether that's 60 pounds if you're working with a porter, or it's more like 20 or 25 pounds if you're not. And so gaining that experience can be difficult for a lot of people who don't have access to elevation. If you have any hills near you with loose rock, you're in business. If you don't, then you have to get a little bit more creative. And I would look around for like loose rock piles or sand dunes or even urban features like retaining walls that you can use in order to safely feel comfortable ascending and descending rock. In the gym, if you don't have access to any of that, in the gym, what you can do is focus on a lot of single leg exercises like squats or lunges with working up to carrying some weight. And you can make those squats or lunges unstable by using a Bosu ball or by working with resistance bands. And so the more you can do that, the more you will start to build up the musculature that you need to ascend and descend that loose rock. I will say there is no substitute. I've worked with many people, led many people in the mountains. There is no substitute for just getting out there and doing it. And it's very hard to teach that in an indoor gym setting. And so if you have any chance, if you live someplace, I grew up in Illinois, if you live in Illinois where it's 100% flat, you might consider traveling to a place like Colorado or the Pacific Northwest, or even, rocky places like Maine on the East Coast where you can have access to ascending and descending that kind of terrain. It seems maybe extravagant or like a big expense to do that, but I weigh that against the cost and the energy of the trip. And if you know that this is a skill that you need in order to be confident and safe on the mountain, then I think it's well worth that extra time to travel. If Aconcagua will be your first multi-week expedition, I think it's also important for people in their preparation to build endurance and also resilience on other long endeavors like multi-day backpack trips with elevation gain, or even a very long bike ride, like a century ride. Anything that helps you build some endurance physically, but also gets you in a state of being uncomfortable and having to work through that because you don't have a choice in the matter. So any situation like that where you can build some resilience, I think will serve you well on a mountain like Aconcagua. I also recommend that you give yourself plenty of time to train and to build the strength that you need, especially if you're not planning to use a porter, because it's no joke to carry 60 pounds at elevation, and your body during the training process needs time to adapt to the stress of carrying that heavy load, to carrying it uphill for several hours on successive days. And then after you've built a very solid level of general fitness, you can begin in your training program to carry weighted backpacks on hikes or on the tread or the stair mill. I'm a big advocate of not adding weight too fast for any athlete and to listen to your body when it comes to adding those extra pounds in your backpack. I aim to add 5 pounds or a little over 2 kilograms for people every 2 weeks. And we'll go even slower if they're telling me their knees are sore or their quads hurt and their body's just not adapting yet to carrying that extra weight. And then I also like to work up to carrying on training hikes about 10% more weight than you'll carry on the mountain. And I think that's important because surprises happen. When I was on Aconcagua, I was actually a part of a rescue, and my backpack, because I had to carry the rescue person's gear, my backpack was way heavier than I had anticipated. And we were descending, so it was doable, but things happen and you want to be a strong member of your team. And so training with a little more weight than you think you'll need, I think, is very important and advisable. Common mistakes that people make on Aconcagua. I've already said it a couple of times, but I will explicitly say it again. People often underestimate that mountain. They think that it's not technical, there's no snow, they don't give it credit for being such a high elevation. and they don't fully prepare mentally or physically for the stress of being on that mountain for 3 weeks. There's also incredibly harsh weather. We talked about the winds and the temperature, and being ready and resilient enough to manage that and to work through that, I think is something that people overlook as well. Aconcagua is also the first expedition for many people. And so getting comfortable in that expedition mode where you're eating weird food, you're maybe not sleeping well, you're having to pack up your tent and gear every day and move up the mountain, all of that can be stressful. You're missing your family. All of those things add to the stress of an expedition. And it's important to be ready for those things, to anticipate them, to think through what might worry you. I've coached many people who, they don't like to be away from their family and they're not sure how they're going to deal with the stress or sometimes the guilt of being in that situation. So think through those things and identify what you think is going to be challenging for you, and then put together a plan to mitigate that or avoid it if you can. The other thing that I see people overlooking is managing their appetite on an expedition, and especially an expedition where you're at high elevation like Aconcagua. And so I would tell people that, when you're packing up and choosing your own snacks to take, if it doesn't sound absolutely delicious to you at sea level or at your home elevation, it will definitely not sound delicious to you when you're on the mountain. So choose snacks that you get excited to eat. And also, very often, I was talking about this with Rebecca Dent in a previous episode, the nutritionist Rebecca Dent, you often have to just reframe eating, because it's not a matter of, do I want to eat this snack? It's a matter of, I need to eat this snack because I need the calories, I need the macros in order to keep climbing and keep performing. And so for some people, it requires this resetting of eating so that you think of it as fuel and something that's required and not something that you really have a choice about. So those are the big mistakes that I see people making. We will link some references, including a history of Aconcagua, in the show notes. But if you're thinking about climbing Aconcagua, drop us a note if you have questions, if you want a little more information about anything that I said here today. I think Aconcagua, of the 7 summits, Aconcagua was probably my least favorite because, especially at that point in my life, I was not a fan of ascending and descending loose rock. And so that made it very difficult for me. But it really is a beautiful mountain in a beautiful place. And it's definitely worth exploring and adding to your list of potential mountains to climb. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If nothing else, you can say that you completed one thing today. All of the resources, products, and guest information that we shared can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. You can also find out more about me and what I'm up to at lisaclimbs.com and at alpineathletics.net. And if you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Cheers!